Good evening and welcome to this evening's free Hayes Education webinar in collaboration with our friend Dr. Anita Devi. I'm Michelle Storer and I'm a Senior Business Director here at Hayes. This evening is the first in a series of 3 free SEND focused webinars that we're going to be hosting over the next school year in collaboration with Anita. And we look forward to welcoming you to those events also. If you haven't signed up yet, or if you want some more information about those events, do drop me an email at the end of the session. My email's on the screen at the bottom there, michelle.storer@hayes.com. So if you want information about any of the upcoming events, or if you wanted any of the slides or the recording of the event this evening, drop me a line and I can make sure that we send those to you. So we are recording the session. Feel free to pop any questions or comments for Anita as we work through the presentation in the chat. We will aim to deal with those at the end. Anita might pick up some things as we go through, but the plan is that we're going to pick up those at the end. This session then, we're looking at practical strategies to support increasing SEND in the classroom and how to effectively direct additional adults to support diverse needs within a classroom environment. So that's our plan and that's our content for this evening. Thanks again for joining us, and I'll hand over to Anita now to get things underway. Thanks again.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, so welcome everyone, and thank you very much to Hayes for having me. It is a privilege to be here and to talk about something that I'm very passionate about SEND, but also how we move from, initial teacher training, ECT, onto someone more experienced. And so whilst we're looking at practical strategies, I kind of did a subtitle and, put it as the evolving confident SEND practitioner. I've been involved in this kind of space for a while. I was involved in the ITT SEND toolkit, the first one, and a lot of the questions at that time we were asking, how much does a trainee need to know? And then moving on from that, well, how much does an early career teacher need to know, and how do we do that? And my own perception and my own perspective is that actually, first of all, we need to see SEND as a system and a system of processes. And that actually we need to be very clear on what we expect trainees to know, and then what we expect early career teachers, and how we continue to grow that, because we will never know everything. I've been involved in education a very long time, although I still look 21, most people would say no. But also that, even my long time in education, my long time in SEND, I still will always keep learning. And I think we've got to position our new entrance to the profession in that way. So I'm starting with a question. As an ECT, what do I need to know about supporting SEND? And that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the practical strategies, and we're also going to look at using additional adults. So I've kind of done it into 3 phases, and it starts with the seeds, which we do at trainee level, and we plant the seeds. And I think, sometimes I hear practitioners talking about trainees should know this and trainees should know that. Actually, they're trainees, and we need to be realistic about what we expect them to know. As we move into the ECT phase of growth in terms of career, then actually we begin to see shoots, and then we move into a much more qualified and confident practitioner. So just to start off with a little bit of a success story, because actually, it's good to kind of think about, does this work in reality? So yesterday and last week, 6 weeks into their training, I've been working with more than 35 early years primary and secondary trainee teachers. They were given a level 6 SEND research presentation to put forward, and they presented those over the last 2 days, and they've all passed. And that was quite phenomenal. Just 6 weeks into their training, they're already beginning to have what they have in terms of a good understanding around SEND, which they will build on as they move into ECT and their further career. So what do I expect trainee teacher should have already experienced? I do believe that they should have read chapter 1 and 6. Sorry, it's not 1 to 6, but 1 and 6 of the SEND Code of Practice. Okay, so the Code of Practice is about 292 pages. I do not expect teachers to read all of that. I do expect them to read chapter 1 and chapter 6, and combined that's about 36 pages. I think Michelle has already said that you will be getting slides if you request them. So we'll be sending those out. So what I'd encourage you to do is, as I'm going through this, please don't take time to write down everything that's on the slide, but just think about your thoughts and what is being triggered by what I'm saying, and that would be much more useful in terms of your note taking. I do expect trainees to focus and harness their skills around high quality teaching and reasonable adjustments in the classroom. If you look at the code of practice, it talks about additional to and different from, and we cannot look at provision that is additional to and different from until we have a baseline, which is our high quality teaching. And so, you know, my advice to trainees is really focusing on that, harness those skills, get that right for every child, and then you're in a place to move that forward. My expectation of trainees is that they have understood the graduated approach, so that they understand the 4 segments of that cycle, and they understand where that is positioned within their own practice and within pedagogy. I encourage them to set up research and knowledge folders that cover at the very least the 4 broad areas of need, and I will show you what that might look like as an example. And for some, as a bonus, they go away and they implement the 1-page profile for every child in their class. And if they're in a secondary school, they try it with their tutor groups. I would not expect trainees necessarily to have an in-depth knowledge of any specific need. Okay, so these are my expectations based on the research that I've done over the years of what I would want trainees to be able to do and say and articulate as they move into that ECT phase. The reality is, though, that training is very varied across the country. There are different models from the undergraduate to the postgraduate model. And so actually they will have varying degrees of knowledge around this. So hence my reason for saying this is where we start. So if you're an ECT on here and actually you haven't actually covered these things, my encouragement would be to go and do that. Read chapters 1 and 6, okay? Think about how secure you are in high quality teaching. We are going to cover some of that today. How much do you know about the graduated approach, apart from just saying what it is? Do you understand and how can you apply it? Can you give examples? Have you met your Senko? Have you met a Senko and just talked to them? And have you set up some folders? So think about those if you haven't had that as part of your training experience already. If we have training providers on here, or ECT mentors, or trainee mentors, again, think about how would you actually encourage your mentees to engage in that planting season of the seeds. So the graduated approach, assess, plan, do, review, spirals up what we call a provision framework. And again, I will show you what that is. And whilst the graduated approach is only mentioned in the code of practice, which is, I think, actually, you know, it's a missed opportunity by the DFE. Assess, plan, do, and review actually is what we do at high quality teaching. It's what I did in the classroom as a practitioner. Our lessons start from a place of assessing. Now that could be a formal assessment, or it could be as simple as, what do you know about the Romans? What do you want to find out? Based on that, we plan our lessons, we deliver, and we review. So within high quality teaching, my expectation is that trainees understand how this 4-part cycle fits into high quality teaching. Because if you can do it at high quality teaching and you have the skills and the understanding of what that involves, you can actually extend that for special educational needs and disability. And if we just look at assess, it's, whilst I've kind of said, yes, it's about what do you know about the Romans and, you know, what do you want to find out? At a deeper level, it's about knowing which assessment tool to use, administering it with fidelity, even if that is just assessment for learning, understanding the data that comes back, and knowing how that data helps someone move on. So assess is quite detailed, as is all of the other 4. And I think sometimes, you know, we kind of quite flippantly just talk about assess, plan, do, and review. But actually, if you go into each one of these segments, there's a lot to consider and think about. And when we look at practical strategies today, we're going to be looking at the plan and the do and a bit of the review. So the transition from trainee into early career teacher. You've qualified, you're celebrating, and then what? So one of the things that I encourage early career teachers to do as they're applying to schools for a job is to actually go and read the annual SEN information report. Every school is required to write one, and it's an annual process. It should be done at the end of the summer term. And what that should tell you is how well the school has delivered SEN in the last year. Okay, so it kind of gives you a flavor of, you know, how responsive they are to students, how responsive they are to parents. Have there been any complaints? What areas do they cover? How do they connect with people locally? So if you're looking for a job and you want to kind of see the SEN aspect, this is a good tool that should be on their website for you to look at. In my career journey, when I was transitioning to deputy, having come from an SEN background, you will be surprised how many schools I went to where, for example, the head would say to me, don't do SEN. So if, you know, it is important that you find out what the school's approach to SEN. In an ideal world, yes, we want every school to be engaging. The reality sometimes, though, is a little bit different. And it is important in your early career status to get the right school for you that will support and nurture you moving forward. So I'm going to do it through a little bit of an example. Welcome to Magpie Academy. This is a large four-form entry school, and you all are newly appointed ECTs. Financially, school's in a good place. They've had a good Ofsted, and yeah, it's been regarded as outstanding for meeting all learners. The school is situated in a deprived area of the city, and what you have there is the demographics, the breakdown of pupils in the school. And again, when I'm supporting those either moving into the ECT phase or further career, one of the things I encourage them to do is go and find out what are the demographics of that school community. What is the number of SEN, percentage-wise, disability, EAL, looked after, and other deprivation factors. So in this Magpie Academy, the SLT have reintroduced you to the concepts from your training as part of your induction, i.e. all the things that I had said previously. Knowing the graduated approach, being secure in high quality teaching, reading chapter 1 and 6, talking to the SENCO, all of those things has been part of your induction into the school. Now in the code of practice and on social media, you will hear the cliche, every teacher is a teacher of SEND, is my response to that, quite frankly. I really don't like that phrase. I think it's too cliche, because here's the reality. Our professional responsibility requires us to be a teacher of every child. So every teacher is a teacher of all learners placed before them. If we start saying we're a teacher of SEND, then we're a teacher of EAL, then we're a teacher of more able, and it just becomes about the label. We have been blessed and privileged to have a group of children, a group of students given to us, and our responsibility is to educate all of them. Now, if you look historically, children with special educational needs and disabilities spent more time out of the classroom with teaching assistants than teachers. And so with this statement comes the belief, and it's a belief that's backed by the UN Charter for the Rights of Children. Every child is entitled to a teacher. So how, as teachers, are we ensuring that they are getting our time? How, as teachers, are we ensuring that we are looking at all learners, not just some? So I mentioned a provision framework, and we're going to use this to look at three things in this session. First of all, high quality teaching. It is a foundation of training. And so in the early career status, that should be an opportunity to go deeper. We're going to look at short-term interventions, and we're going to look at the effective deployment of additional adults. I'm going to pause because I've said quite a lot. Are there any questions? And does anyone want to say anything? Feel free to put your comments in the chat. Cannot see any coming through. I will keep going, I guess. Okay. So the framework is important because, as I've already said, SEN, okay, builds on an idea or a concept of additional to and different from. So we need to know what the baseline is. So the baseline is your high quality teaching. What I'd also encourage everyone to think about, whether you're new to the profession or you're an experienced practitioner, is the distinction between SEN and disability. So disability came about through the Equality Act and was fused into the Children and Families Act in 2014. However, it's possible to have a disability without having a special educational need. It is also possible to have a special educational need without having a disability. And so when we talk about SEND and we put them together, I think sometimes what we're missing is our response, our appropriate response. And it becomes complex because something like mild dyslexia would be classified as a special educational need. Significant dyslexia would be classified as a disability. So disability is anything that is affecting day-to-day life, physical or mental impairment, and over a substantial long-term period. Now that long-term period is identified as 1 year. Here's the challenge though. Let's imagine we have a young person who has anxiety, so social, emotional, mental health as a special educational need. Let's imagine that Magpie Academy puts forward a referral to CAMHS. That referral takes more than a year for them to do some identification because we know that there are waiting lists and backlogs. Now that it's gone on for more than a year, actually we're now into the realm of disability, whereas had we addressed it early on, we would have been addressing SEN. So early identification and accurate identification is really critical. I can see a comment in the chat. Yes, I would agree. Sometimes the Scottish terminology is better. When we talk about, I think, if I'm right in thinking, they talk about additional educational needs. Would that be how you see it, Rob? I'm just waiting for Rob to respond to it, but I'll come back to you, Rob. So, additional support needs, yes, that's what I was. I would say though, Rob, whether you've got additional educational needs, educational support needs, however you frame it, this framework is really good, okay? And this framework has stood the test of time, but also helps everyone understand what is the basic entitlement and what is actually additionality. And it is important, okay? And for some reason, sorry, my slides are frozen. I was saying to the ladies earlier that Zoom has this quirky thing that if you something interrupts, you kind of get stuck there. So I want to start by asking, what does SEND mean to you? Okay, have a think, jot something down. You can put it in the chat if you want to. What is your understanding of SEND? No problems about the fast typing, Rob. Okay, so yeah, we've got Charlotte here sharing that actually the word special can be a challenge because actually they have SEND labels, these adults, and they have bristled with the term special because it doesn't feel special to them. Yeah, and again, terminology matters. It really does. Additional support and consideration. Yep. I'm going to pick up on what Rob has said while other people are putting things in here, because when the government for England put SEND, SEN and disability together, they didn't create a holistic framework. And here's where the challenge is. Disability is about reasonable adjustments. That is about forethought. So if you know that someone's got a disability, You actually put some forethought into what they will need to be part of that community, to be part of that learning environment. With SEN, it's more of a deficit model, okay? And it's more about, well, actually, we're expecting them to be here. This isn't happening. What's going on? So when you fuse these two together, that's when there becomes a problem. Because is it, you know, if we were just looking at disability, we would be looking at reasonable adjustments. We would be looking at those forethoughts. So think about the last classroom that you taught in. Let's imagine a child arrives in that classroom or that school with a wheelchair. Is your school set up, is that classroom set up to take on someone with a wheelchair? If they were in a wheelchair, that would be disability, and that would be a reasonable adjustment. We would think that through before they arrived. SEN, however, is about actually what are we observing, what are we seeing, and actually what do we put into place almost to kind of fill the gap, catch up, move them on. So it's a very different kind of mindset. Charlotte's talking about those that we must cater for above and beyond needed by the general population of the class. Yes, that is SEN, but disability is about reasonable adjustments. And I think, again, just be mindful of how we use that as one kind of context when SEN and disability, come under two different legal structures that have been pushed together, but also involve two different processes. One is forethought, one is focused on a deficit model. And it has frozen. It happens when we put in the chat. So I want to keep using the chat. So what that means is I will just need to be coming in and out. So just bear with me, folks. Someone's asked the question, what do I think about a SEND register? So for me, it's about how you structure that register. I think it's needed, but it's how you structure it, how you use it. And for me, data in school is always about actually how is it helping the learning move forward? So should both things, disability and SEN, be on the same register? So a register isn't just one list. For me, a register, and I prefer the old-fashioned Excel because then you can have different tabs. And so I would have all children, and then I would have my SEN, I would have disability, and I would break it down into the different tabs. And within England, we talk about K, which is our SEN support. I would have that for autumn term, summer term, spring term and summer, because that's a movable beast. And I'll explain why in a bit. So can I come back to that question about the register? I'm sorry. It's just one of those quirky things. Every time we get a chat, it will move itself. I don't know why. I have talked to Zoom about this and they said they don't know why either. So bear with me. So let's look at the classroom and learning environment. Okay, we're going to look at differentiation and personalization and what that means. But within the class context, I've identified a whole range of things that actually come together to make up the learning environment. And some of these are whole school, okay, and some of these are teacher directed, okay. So class incentives and sanctions, okay, you will have a school policy on that. You may think about individual, and that's down to the personalization and you as a teacher, but the class ones and the routines is something that the teacher needs to kind of ensure. What do you have established routines? Do you have established work routines? Now, by work routines, what I mean is the layout of how you want work to be presented. Is there a model in the classroom? So I used to always have a laminated A3, which would have title underlined. I'd have the date where I wanted it, and actually something that's a visual structure for students to see our expectations of how it was laid out. I would also have up in my room the coding that we used for the marking policy. So we had about 3 or 4 codes that we would use, and they were explicitly on the wall. So again, the children knew they weren't expected to remember, they weren't expected to kind of guess. We made that clear. Think about the learning ethos in the classroom. Is there an ethos of risk? Because learning involves risk. Is there an ethos of what's next? Can I stretch myself? Is there an ethos of good feedback between peers, between staff, between students? You know, how would you define the learning ethos in your classroom? Is there a joy of learning? Okay. Is there an anticipation for learning? I was in one school leading a review, and there was an 8-year-old boy, and I tell this story because I love it, but this is an 8-year-old boy who looked after been in the system, been through some really rough things. And I said to him, tell me what it's like at the end of the day for you at school. And his response was, Miss, it's like a soap opera. I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, when I leave school, I'm left with a cliffhanger and I want to come back knowing what I can learn more. Okay. So he felt at the end of each day, he's only learned this much, but there's more to come. And that is about self-efficacy. And self-efficacy is really key for resilience. Now, in COVID and the experiences we've had over the last 3 years, we've got a lot of learners in our classroom who actually don't believe that tomorrow will be a better day, that things can get better, because they've seen a period of time when no one had control. And if you think of our teenagers particularly, that's a time in their life when they're trying to have control over their lives. And yet here was this unseen thing that was taking over. So do you have an ethos of problem solving, of, children feeling a sense of agency, that actually they can change something, they have a voice? All of that matters, and it's all down to that relationship that we create with our students. So what's the interaction between staff and staff? How are they modeling that? But also, what's the interaction between staff and student? How have we used the layout and the seating to enhance the interactions between peers? So do we keep the same students always together, or do we mix it up? So when I go in again to schools and I'm talking to children, and they'll say to me, Miss, we're on the dunce table. So we can dress it up and call it the pink table, the giraffe table, whatever name that you give it. But if you put the same children always together, they're going to walk away thinking we're always in that group. So how are we mixing it up? I'm going to talk a little bit about that as we move through. Feedback. How do we give feedback to the students, either written work or oral feedback? Is it in the moment? Do some of our students need it there and then? Because if you give it, a day later, actually it has had no context, no connection. When they're given feedback in their writing or any written work that they have submitted, are they given time to reflect and go back and think, I'm not sure what that's meant. Let me go and have a check. What does that mean? How can I correct it? What can I do differently? Can I, if we've asked them to use a different adjective, do we give them time at the beginning of the next lesson to actually insert it and try that out? How do we use the displays? I'm amazed when I go into classrooms. Some of them look like IKEA showrooms. They are just flooded, okay? And there's a lot of clutter. The board has lots of stuff. And I've often done activities with children where I'll say to them, here's a yellow Post-it note, and here's a green Post-it note. Go and put the green Post-it note on anything that you think helps you learn. And go and put the yellow Post-it note on anything where you think we should remove. You will be amazed what children think should be on displays that helps them learn. So again, if you're putting up displays, check out, how is it helping the learning? It's not about having a pretty showroom, okay? It is about ensuring that actually children can do it, can use that. And I remember going into an NQT, so that was the old ECT's classroom. And in this classroom, they had right at the top, this whole strip of all the phonemes. And I said, so why is that up there? Because I like to sit on the children's chair, and I'm looking up at this thing from my desk and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is really ranking my neck. So I asked her, why is it up there? Okay, not kind of like eye level. And this NQT kind of said back to me, it's the only space I had left on the wall. Now, that was true, because if you looked around their room, it was full of clutter. And this particular teacher had at least 2 or 3 children in there who had been diagnosed with autism. And they were struggling. There was washing lines everywhere. It was just too much. So it was an overload for the students. So less is more. Strip it back. We don't need this fancy stuff. How we use the resources. Again, concrete resources. We've got a lot of children whose language development isn't quite yet there to just use words and symbols. And I'll show you what that can practically look like as we move through the slides. We'll talk about room layout, and we've already mentioned individual incentives and sanctions. So these are just some of the things that we need to think about when structuring and designing our learning environment. And I've put a question mark because you might actually think of some more things that I've not mentioned. Okay, so this is just to get us started. We're going to look at differentiation and personalization, because that high quality teaching okay, that lower tier of that provision framework, in the Code of Practice, it talks about high quality teaching that is differentiated and personalised. It is both. Now, the Code of Practice went through not just the Department of Education, Department of Health, but it also went through the Ministry of Justice. And they used both of these words for a reason. They are not the same meaning, they mean different things. Differentiation is teacher-led. It is when the teacher uses their knowledge and craft as a teacher, their knowledge of the student and their knowledge of the subject, and brings that together to create a learning environment and activity that enhances the learning. So it's about that process. Personalization is learner-led. So when we talk about the early years, children have schemas of thinking, and we have to translate that when we get to, reception and year 1 into curiosity that links into the curriculum. And that's often where we miss it out. I've had children say to me, I don't see how the curriculum links to where I want to go. So I was leading an intervention group in one of the schools, and it was a more able intervention. And we had a Muslim boy in this group who would never put his hand up in class, would never say anything. So this is a more able student. And in our little small group, I said to him, so what is it you want to do when you grow up? And classic, 7-year-old, I want to be a footballer, miss, famous footballer. So I took a whiteboard pen and I put it in front of him and I said, you are captain of England and you have just won the World Cup. What are you going to say to the press? And he looked at me as if I was completely daft, because for the first time he was suddenly realizing speaking and listening matters in football. He didn't say a word, but you could see that he was thinking it through. I came back the following week and his class teacher said to me, what have you done? And I really wasn't sure what she meant. But then she went on to explain, he is now so enthusiastic about articulating his learning. He is always putting his hand up. He's always offering ideas. So we've had to train him in a bit and kind of rein him in. But the point was, he suddenly saw a connection between what was happening in the classroom and where he wants to go. Now, the chances are he will change his career choice many times in this process. But are we linking the curriculum to where individuals want to go? That is personalization. So effective teaching and learning happens when we, that magic moment when we actually hit personalization and differentiation together. Okay, now how do we do this? I'm a great advocate of the one-page profile. I love it, and I think it should be applied for all children. I haven't got time to go in detail into the one-page profile. If you click the slides and you click on the link, you'll probably find access to one, but also on YouTube, I have done a video for UK Ed Chat many years ago on the one-page profile. So feel free to go and have a look, why it matters and how it enables you to bring in that personalization with your differentiation. Differentiation, people often think about in terms of upper, middle, and lower. There are 18 ways to differentiate folks, okay? And it starts with response signals. So I had a girl in my class who had an EHCP, tall young lady, beautiful lady, beautiful young girl, but she had no self-regulation. So I could be doing my input and she had to sit at the front of the class. I could be doing my input and suddenly she had this urge to jump up and dance. Okay, now, the first time it happened, it was a bit funny. The second time, the kids thought it fine. But, when it got to about the fifth or sixth time, now the other 29 children in my class are getting fed up. Okay, I'm getting a bit fed up, if I'm honest. But what I noticed is I knew when she was about to do it, she just didn't have the self-regulation. So we created a signal. Every time I could see that she was about to jump up, I would just put my hand up. So I could be just talking about the lesson, I could be talking about the tutors or whatever we were doing, and my hand would go up. And she would know that that means don't dance, not now. I also set up a lunchtime dance club for her so that she would have an opportunity to express herself. And she was actually quite good. She was phenomenal. And she and her group went on to win a local authority dance competition. Okay, so response signals. How do we use our non-verbal behaviors to support children who struggle with self-regulation? I don't call, when I was in classroom, I never called it my seating plan. I called it my peer interaction plan, because learning does not happen in a vacuum. It's all about that interaction. And I had 3 PIPs. I had a regular PIP where I thought through where I wanted to place them. We had special PIPs for different topics, for different subjects, and we had choice PIPs. They could come in and choose where they had to sit, but if they messed around and they were given several chances, then we went back to the regular PIP. So my children would often enter the lesson and their first question to me was, Miss, what's the PIP today? They had no idea where they were going to sit. They had no idea why. And none of them actually felt they were on the dunce table, because what they knew is they have been seated there to enhance their learning. When we talk about seating plan, it's often a behavior issue. You've been sat there to control. Well, no, it should be, what is the best seating to extend their learning? And one of the trainees I met this week said she changed the seating around and put a whole group of boys that rarely sit together or rarely allowed to sit together because they're quite loud, she put them on the same table. Putting them on the same table changed their perspective. They suddenly became responsible, and they stopped calling out across the classroom. Completely changed the learning dynamic. So think about your peer interaction plans. You can differentiate by outcome. How you sequence. So do you give very structured sequencing activities, either in trays or through objects? Do you process? So if you've got a process of learning that you've developed and you want the children to go through, have you chunked it into small little bits that enables the students to kind of just take on that little bit, finish that, and then take the next bit? There are a variety of ways of different questioning. Again, how is your questioning styles used to enhance curiosity? Content. So teaching history, I would often have the same text about the Victorians, but 3 different levels. So I'd have the main text that I start with. I would then simplify it for the next level of readers, and then a very simple version for my other. And so actually they were all reading the same text, but just at different levels. Choice boards. I love choice boards. They are 3x3 grids. You can look them up and Google them. And basically, if you've got 9 activities there, you kind of set 2 that are compulsory, that everyone has to do, and then they can choose another 3 of their own choice. And choice is really important to agency, it's important to resilience, and it's also important to problem solving. Time. So imagine I've got a class of 30 children, and I've got one child there who's got working memory difficulties. Now, working memory, the severity of working memory actually correlates with the severity of special education need. So you will find that most children with special education need will have some aspect of working memory need. So I've got Tommy in the front here, who's got a working memory difficulty. I might say to Tommy, Tommy, this is my question for you. I'm going to give you a few minutes to answer it. I'm going to talk to the rest of the class, and then I'm coming back to you. So I give him his question. I talk to the rest of the class. I'm doing whatever I need to do with them. And then I go back to Tommy and I say, so Tommy, what's the answer to your question? We can differentiate in different ways using time, but it doesn't just have to be extra time to do a task. What about thinking time? And one of the things that I often get when I give children one-page profiles is, Miss, I get it, I just need some thinking time. The pace of the lesson and the pace with which we speak. I'm guilty of this, folks. I am so passionate about learning. And when I get passionate about something, I get excited. And when I get excited, I talk faster and faster and faster. And I always had to tell the children, if I'm talking too fast, slow me down, tell me, wave at me, give me a signal. They had a signal for me. And it was great because sometimes we can get so excited about something, we just don't realize. Think about differentiation by support. By resource, I'm going to talk a bit more about that. Through instruction, is the instruction on the board at a vertical plane, or is it on a horizontal plane? Because actually that can make a big difference for children. Or is it verbal? Think about the task, the learner expectations and roles. So for example, when I was setting up, we were doing the genre of newspaper writing, and I put them into teams, and each team had mixed abilities. And Vanessa, I think there's someone wanting to come in the room. And so we actually had some of the SEN within there, and they were given roles within the team to contribute to that newspaper article. Alternative methods of recording. Sometimes our children cognitively understand the lesson and the outcome of the lesson. They cannot just put it on paper, okay? And we are restricting them to having to write paragraphs to demonstrate their learning. But let's say we had an overlapping bubble chart, like a Venn diagram. And let's say the question was, or the outcome of the lesson was, compare and contrast 2 characters from a book. If they can put, just in words or in picture form, the things that are contrasting in the outer aspects of the Venn diagram, and in the overlap, they can put things that are the same, have they met the learning outcome? Absolutely. Have they written a paragraph? No, but they have met the learning outcome. So it's really important to be clear on the difference between the learning outcome of a lesson and the activity of the lesson. And are there things that you can scaffold the activity of the lesson with to ensure that you can demonstrate the learning? Okay. Feedback. If you look on Pinterest, there are 27 different methods of feedback. Okay. And there's a fantastic poster on there. All I would say is bear in mind 4 things. It's timely. So some children need it in the moment now. It's purposeful. So what is the aim of that feedback? What are your expectations having given that feedback? That you're authentic as you give it. Okay. And by that, I don't mean, what I mean is children don't like false praise, or they don't like being overpraised. Okay. And if you look at the research and the great, what makes great teaching that came out of the Sutton Trust in 2014, what they talked about was actually be very specific with your praise and then make it real, be real with them. Okay. Again, it's about relationship. And then finally, assessment. Now, quite a lot of people think about assessment in terms of formative and summative. I like to think about assessment in terms of the role that we're playing. So as the assessment is underway, are we being like the chef and tasting and adapting as we're going along? If that's the case, then there are about 7 different types of assessment that we can use, from ipsative to synoptic, to formatives included in there, to a dynamic. Okay, so there are 7 different ways that we can actually assess as the learning is happening. Then there is that come dine with me scenario. So someone's cooked something in the kitchen, and the only thing that is assessed is what's put on the table. So the fiascos that happened in the kitchen, no one knows about. Whether it's gone well, not well, what's hidden under the plate, no one knows. It's just on the day. That's our Year 6 stats, it's our GCSEs, it's those summative formal assessments. And then you have MasterChef, you know, where you can come along and you can taste something. You can go, oh yes, I can taste the paprika or the cinnamon or the cardamom, whatever. And so you're kind of really drilling down into that diagnostic. Okay, and a good example of that would be the previous APP scales, APP assessment, or the P scales. Okay, so it's where it's really kind of breaking it down into some clarity. So 18 ways to differentiate. Okay, folks, there are 9 ways to personalize. Okay, and it's about enabling learners to be co-designers, linking those aspirations, where they want to go, to the curriculum, encouraging responsibility, ensuring that they're involved in goal setting. The 2 that I really want to pick out on is number 5 and number 8. So decision making is one of the most critical skills we can give our young people for adulthood. Okay. And if you look at chapter 1 in the Code of Practice, one of the principles of the Code of Practice and the Children and Families Act is involving children and young people in decision making. Okay, COVID hit our young people hard because they weren't involved in the decisions. Okay, we had to make decisions. We had to go into lockdown. They had no choice about going out. They had no choice about being with their friends. They had no choice about being online. That was it. And so that's why we have a higher increase in mental health issues and anxiety. But if we can encourage children to get involved in decision making, it enhances their curiosity and it extends their problem solving. This publication that you can see on here by Charles Ledbetter, which is on the Pearson website, it is a free download. Highly recommend it. It takes you through as a practitioner to challenge how you deliver the curriculum, how you design the curriculum to produce and develop and extend and create problem solvers. It's a booklet, a workbook for teachers to go through and challenge themselves about how effective are they in bringing and developing problem solvers in their learners. Number 8 is about metacognition. Okay, now if you look at the Education Endowment Foundation, it is one of the most inexpensive interventions, yielding one of the most highest results, 7 months results if you put metacognition into place. Metacognition, put simply, is thinking about the learning. Now, I don't know many of you on here, but if I was to ask you to think about what you ate for dinner last night in Chinese Mandarin, pretty sure most of you wouldn't be able to tell me. You'd be able to know what you ate for dinner last night, although I think some of you might say, oh, I'm not sure, my memory's gone a bit. But let's assume you have remembered. You wouldn't be able to tell me in Chinese Mandarin because you do not have the language Chinese Mandarin. We want our children to talk about their learning. We have to give them a language for learning. Okay, how do we expect them to talk about it if they don't have it? So metacognition is having a language for learning in your setting that everyone uses to talk about learning. And for me, if I was going into a school, it's one of the most key indicators next to the SEN information report that I look at. What is their language for learning? How do they talk about learning? And it can be as simple as even better if. I've heard reception age children look at drawings of faces where they've got the nose over here and the eye up here, and they're having this peer conversation where one peer is saying to the other, it would be even better if you put the nose in the right place and you brought the eyes down. They're learning. They're talking about their learning, okay? And they're giving each other feedback. So 9 ways to personalize. Now, a language for learning is important, but for every teacher, having a model for learning is really critical. And this is my model for learning. It's not the only one. You could use Vygotsky, you could use Piaget, you could use Bruner, some of the classics that exist, or you can make up your own. For me, learning starts right over here with that sensory input, okay? Children are receiving information from our learning environment through 7 key senses. We have 33 in total, but there's 7 key senses that they're gaining this information. So when I go in to assess a student for special educational needs, I first look at their sensory input. Can they hear? Are they seeing well? Are they understanding? You know, how are they pulling all those different information together? Okay. Let's assume that their sensory input is fine, but they're still struggling with learning. My next point is I make the assumption that they can already learn. They have already learned something. And so I look at how are they applying? Because if you think of learning as a filing cabinet, some children just throw everything in. And so when it comes to actually finding it, they can't. What we need to teach the children then is how to file it and to put those hooks in place and to create those neural pathways so they can go and find information. So I start then looking at how they're applying knowledge, how they're transferring it, what's their level of mastery. Assuming that's okay and they're still struggling with learning, I then look at the learning process, that middle bit. And the learning process is made up of these 6 elements, okay, where we look at attention, language use, memory, perception, problem solving, and thinking. So in terms of the career trajectory of a teacher, by the time you get to early career, I would be expecting you to start thinking about these 6 areas. So having and observing them, understanding them in the classroom, how they help learning, and how not having them can hinder learning. I want to remind you that in the Code of Practice, it says on page 25, high quality teaching is differentiated and personalised, will meet the individual needs of the majority of children. We've got to get that right first and foremost before we put any additionality in. So I said early on that for me, trainee teachers, I expect them to set up these research folders. And these are the schema that I usually give to them. You've got the 4 areas of need in the middle. You've got things around interaction in the classroom, because remember, it's an interactive process. We've got things around theories of learning. So how do teachers perceive learning to happen? We've got child development, which plays a critical part. And we've also got pedagogy. And then over this side, we've got working with parents. So anytime my trainees or ECTs or the colleagues I work with find a piece of information around any of those areas, they file it and they store it well. Because I might give you some information about a child with working memory difficulties. You may not have a child with difficulties of working memory difficulties in your classroom this year, but next year you might. And what you need to be able to do is go and access that information in a way that builds on your knowledge year on year. You might come across a really good research paper about children with ADHD. File it so that when you have a child in your class who has ADHD, you can actually access that. So think about your career as an ECT, not just this year or next year. Actually, how are you building for the future? Some of you will go on to be Senkos. Yes, that would be my joy. Some of you will go on to be middle leaders or senior leaders or head teachers. That will still be my joy. If you have this set up, then you will know how to move your career forward. So the 4 areas of need that we talk about within special education needs and disability in the code of practice is physical and sensory, social, emotional, mental health, communication, interaction, and learning and cognition. And these are based on child development. So they cover 5 aspects of child development, because usually we break up physical and sensory, but in the code of practice, they've put them together. Now, in the code of practice, it doesn't have the Venn diagram, but I have always, whether I was a leader, whether I was a teacher, always used it as a Venn diagram. Because when I think of a student who's got a stutter or a stammer, which would be communication and interaction, I have to consider what social, emotional, mental health difficulties that may produce. So if you look at the wording in blue from the code of practice, this is in chapter 6, one of those things that you should have read by now. The purpose of identification is to work out what action the school needs to take, not just to put them in a category. Okay, so yes, we can have these labels, ASD, ADHD, dyslexia, so what? It's the what do we do next that matters. And actually, if you use the Venn diagram, what you will find is you start to think about other aspects of the students. Think about the King's Speech, how they muffled the ears, and actually that enabled him to speak much more clearly. We've got Educating Essex, the teacher tried that for a GCSE student with their RSE exams. Sometimes we have to use the secondary presenting need to address the primary need. Okay, so think outside the box. Now, you might be thinking, I've got all these needs. And if you look at the data, 1 in 3 children will have DLD. 1 in 3 children will have, 2 in every class will have DLD. 3 children in every class will have dyslexia. 3 children in every class will have ASC. How do we manage? How do we cope? This is one strategy I give to my trainees and ECTs. So imagine you've got a class, you put all the children's names down the side of the children who might need something additional or different to, or need a reasonable adjustment. You think about all those areas that we had talked about that make up the learning environment, the class layout, the resources, the learning, the rewards. What else did we have on there? Interaction, all of those kind of things that we had put out, okay? Start to put in on one sheet of paper what they need, okay? So here you can see I've got child 2, he's left-handed. That's really important for when I sit next to him, because if you get a left-handed person sit next to someone who's right-handed, you get a lot of the elbow stuff. But if you look here, child 2 and 3 and 8 all need concrete resources. So if I'm doing a particular lesson on something and I've got a concrete resource, I'm going to naturally group those 3 children together and say how you work together. So this one-page kind of structure helps you to put all of the needs of these, because on an average class, we're looking at 10 children in every class now having a range of needs. And so this helps to consolidate all those different things that you know about the individual children into one place. And it really works well for secondary, okay? It works well for secondary because imagine you've taught year 8 and they've gone out, and then you've got your year 10s walking in, you've got to get your head around the curriculum and your lesson plan and the children. So this one pager gives you that inner scope, what you can do. From a primary perspective, it provides you with information that you can share with your Senko and that they can share with the parents, or you can share with the parents. So back to our framework. Okay, so just to remind you, we have this framework, the assess, plan, do, review, cycle spirals up there. The Quality Act and high quality teaching, page 25, the Code of Practice, is all about that lower tier, and that's everyone's responsibility. Let's move into short-term interventions. In the Code of Practice, chapter 6, it's very clear this is the responsibility of the class teacher and the subject teacher. And there are 8 reasons why we would put a short-term intervention in place, and only one of them is SEN. So I'm going to rattle through these because I think it's important you understand them, and you'll understand why that becomes important. You have your More Able, your EAL, and your pupil premium. We also have children who have gaps in learning but are cognitively able. So we have a cumulative curriculum, and for some reason they've missed out something and they can't get to the next bit. So if you don't know your number bonds, we're not going to learn times tables. Okay, that's a gap in learning, not an SEN. We also have low attainment. So if you imagine the bell curve, okay, we'll have 25% at one end, 25% at the other, and 50% in the middle. There'll be children on the 24th percentile and the 74th percentile with a bit of support can actually move over. We do booster groups, usually year 6, year 9, and GCSE. Okay, that is not SEN. We have children who have life events. So coming back from COVID, we would have done something for all children in high quality teaching, but there would have been some that we would have needed to do a bit extra. Think of your refugee children, children who go through divorce, bereavement, any of those things. Those life events can be community-based, personal, national, or global. We then have children who have delay, but with a positive trajectory. So if you look at their data over time, they are moving in parallel to their peers, but they appear behind their peers. A good example of this would be your August-born children. In theory, they are 11 months behind their peers, and as a result, they often appear actually not making the same rate of progress. And then reason number 8 is SEN. Okay, so 8 reasons why we would do that. I'm going to switch on the light, folks. There you go. So think about a child who's got a gap in learning, but is cognitively able. What they need is an intervention that fills that gap. They learn their number bonds, and then they go back to high quality teaching. Generally speaking, interventions that are SEN, around SEN, are slow pace, repetitive, highly scaffolded, and chunked. I'll say that again. So SEN interventions tend to be slower pace, repetitive, highly scaffolded, and chunked. Now, if I gave that type of intervention to a child who has a gap in learning but is cognitively able, their motivation is going to drop. If I give an accelerated learning opportunity, which is what I would give to someone who's cognitively able but's got a gap, to a child with SEN, their motivation is going to drop. So why we're putting the intervention in place really matters. And that's where we have to look at the data. We have to understand the data and think about the intention behind the intervention. Because it's possible to put all children, say a group of children through a phonics screening or phonics test. And let's say we get 5 children who come out with the same score, but those 5 children have the score for a different reason. What we tend to do sometimes is just put them in one group and give them to Mrs. Smith, and Mrs. Smith can run a phonics group. We're doing the children a disservice. So as an early career teacher, I would be expecting you to start now looking at the data behind the intervention and why we need it, okay? It is your responsibility to not necessarily deliver the intervention, because you may have support from additional adults, but you do have to have an oversight of that an intervention is happening. When we say short term, we usually mean 6 to 12 weeks. So that it's a very short, sharp, it's very finite. We tell parents it's finite, and that people don't expect it to go on forever. There are 2 exceptions to that. One is a authentic nurture group, which usually lasts a year because of the assessment model, and reading recovery. Most of the others, 6 to 12 weeks. If after 12 weeks we are not seeing significant progress because of that intervention, something is not right. Either the intervention's wrong, we've identified wrong, or it's not being delivered correctly. So as a teacher, you need to be saying after 12 weeks, I'm expecting progress in this. And if it's not happening, something's not right. What level of progress we expect is usually 1.5 times the normal rate. Because remember, we're doing additional to and different from. So if we've put an intervention in place, let's say for reading over 12 weeks, that's 3 months. My expectation, if that intervention is effective, would be that the child would make 4.5 to 5 months reading age progress. If they're only making 3 months reading age progress, that intervention has been ineffective, because all that is their chronological age that has developed. So be clear on what your expectation is at the end of the 6 or 12 weeks. Short-term interventions, I talked about pace, chunking, repetition. It's about the effective use of data. Please note your disability is part of your high quality teaching, and it's your reasonable adjustments. Your short-term interventions are about SEN. I explained the difference between the two earlier on. So we get to this place, we've got all of this stuff to do, and we've got no adults in the room to help, because everyone thinks the best thing we need is a one-to-one or a TA in the room. How do we move that forward? Let's go back to Magpie Academy. And the bit that's changed at the bottom is, surprise, surprise, SLT are discussing whether each class will have a full-time learning support assistant. Should we not have one? So where does that conversation go? Well, already in the staff room, there's a little bit of tension, because the first question that comes up is, what do we call them? Some feel that it should be called teaching assistant. So they should be called teaching assistants. Others prefer learning support assistants. Some have a completely different idea. Classroom assistants, mentors, learning mentors, a whole range of things. Why am I asking this question? I think the name reflects what you think they're going to do. Sometimes when we talk about teaching assistants, they're not there to support the teaching, they're there to support the learning. So be clear, okay? Be clear that their role is there to support the learning. And the success of a learning support assistant, for me, is when they can walk away and the child can do it by themselves. So I tell my learning assistants when I was in the classroom and they were supporting me, success means you will be able to walk away from that child and they'll be able to do it on their own. Do your additional adults know that that's what success means? Have you communicated that? Now, the teacher stands is also very clear about who directs them. If we'd had time, we would have actually talked about what are the advantages of having an LSA in the classroom and what are some of the challenges. I'm conscious of time and I do want to kind of make sure we finish to time. So that may be something you think about. But one of the challenges I've often had with trainees and early career teachers is, and it happened to me in my career, you go into the classroom and the teaching assistant is older than you, more experienced, and knows the children better than you. However, the reality is this: if you look at the teacher standards, it's our responsibility, okay? We are required as teachers to direct our teaching support staff. So whether they are older than you, they know more than you, or they've been in the school longer than you, it doesn't matter. As ECTs, you are required to direct them. So as you plan the lesson, if you know that you've got an additional adult in the room, your responsibility is to say, what is it they're going to be doing? And if all they're doing is sitting and listening to your input while you're doing it, that's not effective use of an adult. Okay, so think about that through as you plan your lessons. We do expect, well, I certainly expect ECTs to get more and more confident around this, to be more intentional about this. And sometimes it's about saying, okay, so I've done the input, I'm going to work as a teacher with this group of children with SEN, and I'm going to ask my teaching assistant to float around the room, the helicopter model, and work with my more able or my independent learners. The additional adult doesn't have to always be with our most vulnerable. Again, it comes back to, do we believe that every child should have access to a teacher? If we do, a qualified teacher, if we do, then we need to make that happen in our classroom. So think about how you use your teaching assistants, not just for your SEN, but actually for the other children. What is their role as teaching assistants? Are they a team member? Are they an extra resource? Are they provider resources? Okay, so can they create something that will help explain the lesson? Are they an observer? Can they see things that we as teachers can't? Do they give feedback? Are they there for pastoral? You might think of some others. I would say it's all of those. But in that lesson that you're about to teach, if you have an additional adult, be intentional and communicate to them what you want them to be. You might be team teaching. You might actually use them as a resource to model something. You might actually say to them, I'm going to be teaching about angles today. Can you bring the giant protractor from the SEN resource department because so-and-so's got dyspraxia and they can't coordinate the little protractors. You might ask them to observe the children and give you feedback, or give you feedback on the learning that's happened. Or it might be that you know that you've got some children who are actually have come in without breakfast, and actually their first duty is go and get them some breakfast. Think about how you use them. They have not just got one role. Additional adults in the classroom. Okay, so there are 3 aspects to this that I want to kind of quickly cover, and we will finish on time. We're going to talk about them in the classroom, additional adults out of the classroom, and the communication. And just to be awkward, I'm going to start with the last one first. So we're going to go 3, 2, and 1. Because for me, it starts with communication. How do we as teachers communicate with an additional adult who's going to be in the classroom? How do we communicate before the lesson so that when they come in, they know exactly what the lesson's going to be about and what role they're going to play? How do we communicate during the lesson? You'll be amazed how many teaching assistants say to me, particularly in secondary, the teachers don't even know our names. They just keep going, miss, miss. Actually, we need to model to the children good behavior. What communication happens after class? They have been an extra pair of eyes in the room. What have they seen that we have missed as teachers? Because as a teacher, I've got my eyes on 30 children. I might not see something and they might come and say, well, Tommy got the outcome, but Tamara needed some more help. And the final thing is, how do we show our appreciation for them? I love being a teacher. I love being in the classroom. I could never be a teaching assistant. They are a rare breed. And so again, making sure that we acknowledge and we value them is good modeling to the children, but also for them in what they're doing. So start to think about how you communicate with any additional adults. I'm just going to whiz through this slide. So when you get the slides, we've talked about the 4 areas of need. Identification comes down to 3 things: the history of the child and their journey, the environment, and how we use our critical thinking to combine those and triangulate. So this link is a blog that I wrote about identification and differential diagnosis. And I think it just might help you to think about how you use feedback in the classroom and observations in the classroom to really drill down on the children's needs. We've already talked about intervention data for short-term interventions. And if you're running an intervention, basically you would need a baseline data, expected outcome. So at the end of this 6 or 12 weeks, where did they think the child will be? And the exit data. We need attendance at the intervention, and you may have some general behavior comments. This graphic is from the Send Review portal, and it kind of then helps to think about the dialogue that comes as a result of that intervention. So if the entry data equals the expected outcome, or if the exit data is more than the entry data, all of those kind of combinations, what is this telling us about that intervention? So we've done communication out of the classroom. There are often interventions run by TAs. The question as a class teacher or a subject teacher is simply this: if you've got a small group who are learning to use their phonics or learn to use grammar outside in a small group, or learning to do speaking and listening or behavior, resilience, whatever they're doing in that small intervention outside the classroom, how are you enabling the child to come in the classroom and use that, to transfer that? And that's why you have to have an overview of the intervention, even if you're not delivering it, even if it's outside the classroom. The child needs to know that you know, and that we're bringing it back into the classroom. Okay, so if they're doing their phonics and they're doing their phonemes, I want to see you start using that in your writing. I'm going to be checking that so that they learn to start transferring it from that small group back into the main learning environment. And finally, in the classroom, we've talked about learning support assistant. How do you make that happen? That's where you use your differentiation, your personalization, you think about your learning support assistant, and you're clear on what success will look like. These are the 3 areas of using a learning support assistant or an additional adult: how we communicate with them, how we engage in outside of the classroom interventions that they may be delivering, and if they are in our classroom, what happens next. These are all part of what we call making the best use of teaching assistants. They're based on the 7 recommendations that came out of the research by the Education Endowment Foundation. Principle 7 is about communication. 5 and 6 are about interventions out of class. Okay, so one of them is evidence-based and the other is in-house developed ideas. And then principles 1 to 4 is about how we how we make the most of teaching assistants in the classroom. Okay, so it's Sunday, you've planned the week's lessons, you have a clear idea how you're going to use your learning support assistant, and you connect the outside interventions to your classroom. As I said, it's Sunday evening, you're sitting there, you're chilling with a glass of wine with your loved ones, life is good. And then the phone rings. Spanner in the works. Your learning support assistant is ill and isn't coming in the next day. What are you going to do? Because we won't always have someone there. Think about your classroom management. Have you got those routines established? Think about your room layout. One of the things that I used to do if I didn't have a teaching assistant is I would have a desk at a 45-degree angle at the front of the room. After I'd done my input, I would sit at this desk and any student could come out for 2 minutes, I had the timer, and ask me a question and talk about the work or whatever they needed, and then they would go back. I still had the panoramic view of the whole class, but I was helping children. That was coupled with teaching the children and my LSAs that when a child put their hand up and said, "Miss, I want some help," our first response to the child was always, "How can I help you?" Because sometimes the child puts their hand up and says, "I want some help," and my TAs would jump in, do something for them, and then they go, "Yeah, I knew that bit. I didn't need that. I needed it on this." So when your children are asking for help, have you trained your LSAs? Have you trained yourself to always say, "How can I help you?" Because again, what we're enabling the children is to articulate their learning. And I've had children come back and say, "Miss, I get this bit. The bit I'm really stuck on is this. Can you help me with just this bit?" That is really good level of metacognition. They're articulating the learning, they know where their strengths are, and they know where they need support. I have talked quite a bit. I've shared quite a lot. I want you to think about 3 things that you're taking away from this session. Just write them down, draw many notes, just jottings for yourself. What are the 3 key things that have stood out for you? When you've got your 3 things, I want you to choose just one of those. Okay, pick one. How would you connect that one to previous knowledge? Something you knew before you came into this room. How would you connect it to that? Still focusing on that one. Now you know where you've connected it. What has changed since you've been in this room? We've been together for about 70, 80 minutes. What has changed in your thinking? What did you know before you came in the room? What has changed in your thinking? Because that's when real development happens. And then still focused on that one thing. What are you going to go away and create as a result around that one thing in your classroom that's going to be different? finally, what difference do you think that will make by doing that one thing? How will it impact the children? And what will be your evidence of that? Because you can come to sessions like this and say, yeah, we learned a lot, and that's great. What I'm more interested in is how you develop. You take your learning and you develop from that. We're going to open it up to questions, just a couple of resources. So I was very fortunate to be involved in the first SEND ECT book 2 years ago. That's available if you want it. It covers a lot of what I've talked about, but in more depth, and particularly the 4 areas of need. You get a very in-depth understanding of that. If reading is not your thing, there's a high-speed training course that I wrote around the same thing. Again, it's about SEND in the classroom, some really practical strategies, some videos, things that you can use to actually move your career forward. Neither of these are very expensive, but they are a good investment in actually you thinking about where do you go from here. So in terms of bringing this session together and SEND in the classroom, 2 things. It's about managing your learning environment when you have a high number of SEND in your class, and that is the reality for most. And it is about managing and directing additional adults and interventions. Can I please remind you, every teacher is a teacher of all the learners placed before them. It's not every teacher is a teacher of SEND. We're teachers of all children, and we are very blessed to have them in our care. So feel free to stay in touch. I'd love to hear how you flourish into leadership, into Senkos. Over to you, Michelle.
Thanks, Anita. That was brilliant. Does anybody have any additional questions or comments that they wanted to pop into the chat just before we go? I know that Anita is happy to.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang around. I just don't want to keep you. We've got about 10 minutes actually, so we can have a conversation.
Yeah, if anybody wants to pop any questions in, we will forward a recording of the session and the slides to everybody that's attended. So it might not be tomorrow, certainly by Thursday you should get those. So if you keep an eye out in your inbox for those. I can also send through an interactive flyer that's got information about the subsequent 2 courses that are coming up that Anita is very kindly delivering for us. One on Senko Wellbeing, which is in the new year, and then later on in the year, Anita and a colleague of mine who looks after our careers and employability products and services are going to be looking at careers and employability workshops for SEND. So that's coming later on in the year.
So we've got a few minutes. If people wouldn't mind unmuting themselves, what is your key takeaway from this session? And what are you going to go and do differently? Anyone? I don't want to pick, but it would be great if you could just unmute yourselves and say a few words so we can hear your voice.
Hello, this is Charlotte.
Hiya.
I just wanted to say that I think that as a newly qualified, I'm actually not a newly qualified teacher or a early careers teacher, I'm a Senko, but I found this really interesting in how to support newly qualified teachers, and particularly the thing I hear a lot is how to manage additional adults in your classroom, and often like you touched on, at times it can be a little bit of a hindrance if actually not managed well. So we need to know how to harness that support, because it's so valuable. And I really took away some small key points of how to support particularly one teacher I'm thinking of that really struggles with that, and the emphasis on actually you really can work with the blue table if you want to. You know, it's really important that teachers are working with that table too, and you aren't always just often sending them out into a corridor to work with a teaching assistant. Just one of my bugbears, and I really do think that that was well put across in the training, so thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the feedback, Charlotte. Appreciate that. Anyone else? Come on, don't be shy. This is your opportunity. Rob from Scotland. I'm just going to pick now because you got the dog. Are you there?
He's shy.
He's shy. Someone's put something in the chat which I haven't said. Okay, so Jamie Lee is saying that I'm going to be using the differentiation and let me read this. Oh, we've got some stuff coming in the chat. Yeah, okay, if you want to put it in the chat, let's do that. Oh, and someone asked about the send register. We can go back to that conversation. I'm going to use the differentiation personalization. I previously knew about differentiation and how to use this, but not personalization. Thank you for that, Jamie. So Charlotte, you had the question, she's still there, yes, about the send register. So if you think about when I talked about the interventions, our SEN support is the K data, and that will change term on term because of its 6 to 12 weeks. And so I would encourage SENCOs to have tabs at the bottom where you would have your K data for autumn, your K data for spring, and then your K data for summer. And they may be different across those 3 tabs. Okay, I hope that answers your question. Who else we got? Liz. Hello, Liz. You going to share anything? What your key takeaway is? Oh, we've got a message. Right. We don't want to keep you here for the sake of it. We don't want to. It's like, you go into school and say, good morning, and no one says hello. Ah, Rob is wandering around the house with his iPad. There you go. Hadn't considered personalization. Thank you. And good links to the science capital teaching approaches, the Aspires project. Yes, I would agree with that totally. Okay, cool. Vinda, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to echo what the others have mentioned about I need to read more about personalization and differentiation and kind of get that clear in my head so that I know that's that and that's that. So that's my sort of next bit of homework. I need to sort of read my notes again because I've written so many notes today.
Okay, so I'm glad you found it useful.
Very, thank you.
You're very welcome. Amy. Now you've got me picking on people.
I think there's a comment from Liz in the chat.
Oh, there is. Thank you, Liz. Really interested in developing self-help strategies for all learners. How can I help you? Question. Well, absolutely. It's really powerful, Liz. And particularly if the TAs learn to do that as well. You kind of develop that independence. I can see people are ready to go. We don't want to keep you for the sake of it. Michelle, did you want to conclude with anything? Can I just say thank you guys so much for bearing with us. Hope it's useful. You'll get the recording and me talking very fast, but it will be useful with all the slides. So thank you, Michelle.
Yeah, and thank you from us. Like I say, I'll send you details of the upcoming free courses later on in the year with Anita. You'll get the information. Any feedback or any suggestions about any of the courses or any of the content that you think would be useful, feel free to email that to me as well, michelle.storer@hayes.com. And any feedback about the session obviously is welcome. So thanks again for joining us.
Take care, guys.
Thank you, everyone.